Okay, good evening, everyone. Good to see you. You can't hear me? We are in Luke chapter 7 tonight. Luke chapter 7. In this chapter, I think one of the things that stands out a little bit is the compassion of Jesus. Now, that's not new. We've seen evidence of that already as we've in this book. But I think here it kind of comes out again. We see this by his actions. I mean, there is his love for those who are lost, those who are in sin. His love for each one becomes so very clear. But in particular, those who present a humble heart, the Lord always responds to that. You know, as the ministry of Jesus is moving on, we're into the second year of his ministry at this point. You know, it's marked by those who are enemies to him. And they seem to be, standing out all the more as time goes on. There are those who recognize him as the one sent by God. And just as far as an extreme from that are those who reject the idea that he is the one sent by God. It's interesting, they're hearing the same message. Jesus is not preaching one thing to these and something different to these. He's preaching the same message, but they're responding very differently. But that's always the case. I mean, throughout the Bible story in the Old Testament, it's the same thing. You know, the prophets that God sent, he would speak the same message to all, and there were some who would respond to that message. There were many who turned and walked away. And it's no different now in the life and the times of Jesus. We see in this chapter a number of miracles. It seems as we got into the latter part of the first year of the ministry of Jesus, those were increasing. And now in this second year, there's a lot of miracles being performed by Jesus. John would say at the end of his gospel that there were so many miracles that the Lord had performed that they could not even be recorded in books. He said, but these are recorded so that you may understand, that you may believe. And so we have these miracles for that reason, for that purpose. Because it demonstrates to us the power of Jesus. It confirms his deity, that he is God. But it also, I think, provides some insight to his compassion. And that's part of what we see standing out here in this lesson tonight. Real quick, let's take a road trip. Here's our map, the same map we've been looking at. And Jesus is preaching in this northern part of Galilee and around the northern part of the Sea of Galilee. Jesus spent a lot of time there. Sometimes we think about Jesus preaching, we start thinking about Jerusalem and events that took place there. Significant for sure. But there's a lot of time that Jesus spent far north of there, up in this area here. Capernaum is in our chapter tonight. Again, Jesus is back there, again in Capernaum. And then we're going to take a trip down to Nain, down here, this town, about 20 miles southwest of Capernaum. And so we'll be heading there in just a moment. I'll talk about Capernaum for just a moment. Here's that picture again. Taken from a hill on the north side, looking back down at the Sea of Galilee. And I think at this settlement right down here, I think that's Capernaum. I'm not positive, but it kind of looks like where it would be. And that's where we're going today in this chapter. Here's an aerial. No, I didn't take this picture. An aerial view of Capernaum, what has been excavated and found. There's a whole lot more to the city than what's in this square. All the way out through here, far out, is still uncovered, is the old city of Capernaum. But there's some interesting things here right in downtown, we might say, down by the waterfront. In particular, the synagogue that comes into play tonight in this particular lesson. Jesus spent a lot of time there, we recognize. It was Peter's house where Peter lived. And so Jesus was there often. There seemed to be a lot of disciples around this area. And in fact, some believe that they have found the house site of Peter. And it's underneath this, I'll come back here in a minute. It's underneath this dome. Actually, the Catholic Church has built this dome and a museum over top of a site that supposedly is the house site of Peter. Who knows, it could be. And who knows, maybe it's not that at all. But there's a lot of interest there in that site. And throughout that part of the city, you can look at, as you walk through and look at the ruins, I mean, you can see the walls and the foundation of homes and shops and things like that. You can see the streets that were there, would have been in the 1st century. You notice how dark these stones are, the rocks, that from the ancient city that was built. These stones came from that area, and they're all very dark in their composition. And so it tells us something about, the 1st century build of that city. But there's a synagogue that is there. I find this to be most interesting. The remnants of this synagogue right here is actually a 4th century synagogue. And so the walls around this synagogue, what has been restored there, that's not where Jesus preached in those walls. But that is the spot where he preached. Because there are also here, this 4th century synagogue was built on top of the walls of the 1st century synagogue. See those black stones there? And so I do find that to be interesting, to be able to think. I mean, there's a lot of things that people say, in the Bible language, like Jesus was here. Well, he was here somewhere for sure. But this is one of those places with some assurity that Jesus preached in the synagogue in Capernaum. Now, it wasn't in these walls, it's the 4th century walls, but it was here on this side is where Jesus preached. I think it's kind of interesting to think about and to see sites like that. Let's get into this chapter number 7. And looking at, we're not going to read all of it, of course, we're just hitting a few points here. In some areas that we're not going to hardly touch on at all, what I'm trying to draw out of this lesson again is the compassion of Jesus. Because in this chapter we see it in such a huge way. I want us to spend some time considering that. In chapter 8 of the book of Luke, in the first 10 verses, we find the healing of the centurion's servant. Now I have some questions for you, and I'd like to hear how you respond on these things. So this centurion, who is he? And what do we know about him? The centurion here of Luke chapter 7. What can you say? Charge of 100 men or more. It's at least that. He was a man of some authority. Roman. He'd been a Roman soldier, of course. And so we understand his allegiance that way. I just don't imagine you become a centurion or some officer in the Roman army without pledging some allegiance to the Roman, don't you think? What else do we see? What else do we know? A humble man. Now, this is striking to me. Because I would first think of an officer in the Roman army probably didn't get to that position by being humble. But maybe I'm wrong about that. Because here is a man who, as we read on, was a humble man. What else could we say? What else do we know about this centurion? He treated his servants well. And he seems to be a man of faith. Is that striking? He was a friend to the Jews. What did he do? He built the synagogue. And so I'm assuming he's using Roman money for that. And somehow, I guess we could say the Roman government had something to do with building the Jewish synagogue, there in that 1st century synagogue that we were talking about in Capernaum. Well, that's interesting. And so that kind of sets the tone a little bit here of some things going on here in this region of Capernaum. Here is a man who, as the text would say, he loves our nation. That was the Jews talking about the Jewish nation. Here is a man who loves our nation. He built us a synagogue. Makes me wonder a little bit, could he have been a proselyte? Could he have been one who was converting to Judaism? It doesn't say that. But don't you wonder just a little, could that be the case?
The Jews thought he was worthy.
That's right. Oh, that's right. When it comes to the healing of this man's servant, the comment of the Jews concerning the centurion, he's a worthy man. I don't know, but I've kind of thought that sometimes the judgment of many of the Jews is pretty harsh about some things like that. And so I think that speaks to the centurion, something about him. So you say we have some pretty good insight, to this man, to the life and the times that were going on and the location and something about this man. We know some things about this man right here. Okay, now someone mentioned, or maybe more than one. Yeah.
Well, we know that he had strong faith in what Jesus could do.
Okay, so there's two things that stand out in a huge way to me. It's his humility and his faith. Okay, so somebody mentioned already his humility. Expound on that a little bit. In what way do we know about his humility? What is that about? What makes us say he was a humble man? What makes us say that? Alan?
But he talks about not being worthy.
Yeah, I'm not even worthy to ask this, kind of a thing. Donna?
I was just going to say he took care of that servant. He cared about him.
Yeah.
Which is more of a humble thing, caring about somebody else.
The centurion had concern and compassion on his servant. Okay, I don't think that happened all the time. But we see that standing out with him. And then speaking of Jesus said, I am not worthy for you to enter my house. That was what he was saying to Jesus. I'm not even worthy for you to come to me, he said. Okay, so then what about his faith? What we learn about his faith? What makes us say that he's a man of faith? He believed Jesus could heal. You just say the word. You don't even have to come. You just speak the word, and my servant will be healed. That's pretty impressive. And that speaks a lot to his faith.
He obviously had an earlier experiences with Jesus to know that. I think also the implication is he knew who Jesus was.
He knew who Jesus was. I think this is an interesting point. And again, thinking back for a moment, Jesus has been to Capernaum before. And he has preached all through this northern region of the Sea of Galilee. And so as we see in this chapter and the chapter to come, the following of Jesus has grown quite large. His notoriety has become quite large. In Matthew's account of the same event, there was something, so I'm just going to read to you here real quick in this account, something that Jesus said when he heard of the faith of this centurion. He says, "Assuredly, I say to you, I have not found such great faith, not even in Israel." Speaking of the children of Israel. "And I say to you that many will come from the east and the west and sit down with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. But the sons of the kingdom will be cast out into outer darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth." What is that? What did Jesus just say to those who were gathered there? What's he mean when he says, there'll be some who come from the east and the west from parts far away? Who's he speaking of? It's kind of figuratively, but who's he speaking of? The Jews? The Gentiles. And here's this indication that Jesus is giving to those Jews. It's not all about you. In fact, some who are in this nation, in this kingdom, some who are in this nation, this kingdom, are going to be met with wailing and gnashing of teeth. Judgment against them. So that was all part of this episode right here as well. And so some things then that stand out about this centurion. He had a love for God, a love for the Lord. He respected Jesus, had total confidence in Jesus. He was a humble man. He was a man of faith. And all of those are attributes that really stand out. Anything else you would say about him? Yes, Jared?
He respected authority.
Oh, well, yeah. Good point. That he respected. How do we know that? What did he say?
He was in a position of authority.
Yeah.
He understood that people did what he told them to do. And so he alluded to Jesus. He recognized that Jesus had a supreme authority.
Yeah.
To say,
Oh.
say that my servant is healed, the servant will be healed. That's impressive.
So this officer, in the military, he knew something about what authority was. He also understood how to recognize one who is in authority. And there had been enough evidence presented at this point. Evidence for all, not just for him, but evidence presented for all that Jesus was a man of supreme authority. I appreciate the way you said that. Of supreme authority. All right, good. Good thoughts. All right, so this storyline moves on, and we look at verses 11 through 17, raising the dead. So we try to picture this scene. I think it's a very interesting unfolding of some events. I mean, when you're reading through those verses 11 through 17, we find that Jesus had gone to the city of Nain. We saw that on the map. 20 miles or so southwest of Capernaum. And so Jesus had traveled down to that city, and there were many disciples following Jesus, the text would say. And there was a large crowd of others. I'm not exactly sure who the others are, but there seems to be a distinction between those who were disciples, those who were truly learners and followers of Jesus, and there were some others following along as well. Maybe just some curious folks seeking to know and understand. But there was a crowd that followed Jesus. And so when they come to the city gates, what happens there?
Dead man was being carried out.
So there's a dead man being carried out, of the city. What else do we see with that?
Well, he was her only son.
So here is a widow who is preparing to bury her only son. Who else are with him? A large crowd. Another large crowd? So our large crowd just got larger. Because we have the disciples of Jesus, we have the others who are following along, and now we have at the city gate, they're coming to the city gate, and now there's these coming out of the city gate, a large crowd. Wow, what an opportunity for preaching. All right? And so Jesus is going to use this opportunity, but I'm telling you, I'm just struck by the idea that it was not only the idea of preaching that Jesus was looking at. What else do you think, Wayne?
Sorry for the widow whose child had died.
So there's this compassion. When he sees this woman who is a widow, he would know that, and sees the grief that is here and the weeping, and he had compassion on her, and he said, "Do not weep." And yet, how does one not weep in a circumstance as that? But of course, Jesus knew that there was going to be a reason for rejoicing. I don't suppose that this mother knows that at this point when Jesus says, "Do not weep." What else might we see that indicates compassion? Anything else there that would stand out? It's interesting to me that the way he went up to the coffin and stood there and put his hand on and touched the open coffin. And why would he do that? What could that even, represent? What do you think?
I think the contrast is and said something, as opposed to touching the man and saying something. The sheer power of his word, I say to you, is to be emphasized in the story, because that shows his authority, his power, his unique power that he had.
It is something about his authority again that we see. Jesus undoubtedly already knows what he's going to do. And I do believe it's compassion on this mother that moves him in such a way. And the many that are grieving, the fact that there are many that are grieving, doesn't that say something too? About the woman or about the young man who has died? It says something that way. And Jesus walks up there and he touches the coffin and he said, young man, I say to you, arise. And he who was dead sat up and began to speak. And he presented him to his mother.
Does that teach us a lesson? We better do what Jesus says?
Yes. Yeah, I think we can make that application too. So just an incredible story that unfolds here. What about the faith of this woman who lost her son? Did she have great faith? We know about the faith of the centurion. He expressed his faith. But sometimes we've seen this already in previous chapters. Sometimes there were miracles and healings that took place with those who seemingly had no relationship with the Lord at all, did not express any kind of faith. That would be that way here too. So again, some points there about the compassion of Jesus. The next section here of the scripture, John the Baptist comes back into the story. So John is in prison. And I find this to be kind of an interesting tale right here when the disciples of John had told John all the things concerning the Lord, the things that they were hearing him preach and the things that they were seeing. And yet John says to his disciples to go to Jesus and say, are you the coming one, or should we look for another? That's an interesting question to me. And don't you wonder what drove or what motivated John to ask that question to Jesus? Are you the one? So what happened there? Is this a lack of faith on the part of John? Is there something more to that story?
He's in prison.
He's in prison. How much of this has he seen? He's in prison, so he's not seeing these events. His disciples have told him about these things. Do you suppose that maybe his disciples could be asking questions like, is this the one? And why would anyone at this point ask if Jesus is the one sent by God? Why would John knew there was one that was coming for this purpose. But why would anybody ask at this point of Jesus, are you the one? Is Jesus what all we're expecting? No. Well, in what way no? What were they expecting? How did John foretell Jesus? The one who is coming that is greater than I, whose sandals I'm not worthy to lash. How did John describe Jesus? As the compassionate one? I don't think so. I don't remember that part. How did he describe Jesus? Kind of as one making judgment, right? Yeah, making judgment with fire. And has Jesus done that? Well, not so much at this point. Now, there is more of that judgment that Jesus is going to make when we get to the latter part of year 3. But not so much now. I wondered, would that cause John to think, are you the one? This is not what I was expecting here. And so, some then maybe get a little bit critical about John. But what did Jesus say about John the Baptist that kind of supported John? What did he say a little bit later?
He identified John the Baptist as the prophet who had been spoken about in the Old Testament.
Okay, so Jesus makes the point about John being that prophet and describes him in some interesting ways, I think. Where is this here? Yeah, in verse 28, but I say to you, among those born of women, there is not a greater prophet than John the Baptist, but he who is least in the kingdom of God is greater than he. Foretelling some things even yet to come. Described him in verse 25. Verse 24, what did you go out in the wilderness to see? A reed shaken by the wind? Did you go out to see John as one who is weak? A reed shaken by the wind? Is that what you saw? Oh no. They saw exactly opposite of that. But what did you go out and see? A man clothed in soft garments? Indeed. Those who are gorgeously apparelled and live in luxury are in king's courts. Now that wasn't John. It's really, he says some things here to support John in this way. Jesus turned to the crowd and again talked to him about John, defended John, reminded them, what did you see of John? Someone who was strong, someone who was a prophet, someone who was foretelling some things who were to come. Okay, in verse 36 and following, we get into another story. Another event that takes place. Jesus is invited to the home of Simon, a Pharisee. Well, it's not the only time that Jesus would have an opportunity as that, but maybe still it would seem a little unusual that Jesus would be invited to an affair such as that. Why? Why would that be unusual? What would you think? Why would that be unusual? Because the Pharisees are such supporters of Jesus now, right? No. And so it's interesting to me that Simon has invited Jesus. I'm not sure that I fully understand all the reasons why he invited him. And there are some others there. Who stopped into the feast?
A sinful woman.
A sinful woman. And so, don't you kind of wonder what that looked like? What everybody sitting at the feast thought when this woman came in. And then what did she do? Went to Jesus. And what did she do? Washed his feet. Okay. So what is significant about that? And why is there a point about that?
It was expensive.
It was expensive. The perfume that she put on was expensive. Okay, so there was some cost that way.
Because normally when you go to a dinner, they have the means for you to wash your feet before you sit.
Now this is interesting. This Pharisee who invited Jesus and some others to come maybe was of some means to be able to put together a feast like this. And you're right, that there would have been, probably not him, but a servant or someone who would wash the feet of those who are coming. It's a kind gesture to do. And yet Jesus says later in the text that you didn't wash my feet. When now there are those who have become critical of the sinful woman who was washing his feet, and he says, but you didn't do this. You didn't offer me any water to wash my feet. You didn't offer me any comfort in any way. But this woman did.
There's a huge contrast between the respect that she showed Jesus and this Pharisee showed. He went in with no
So there's the lack of respect from the one who invited him to the party, to the feast. There is that. In fact, I think we can take to the point of saying he showed disrespect by not offering to do that. When this sinful woman came in and washed his feet, what does that say about her? I think this gets to be more about her than him, though there's a lot about him in this. What does this say about her?
She recognized Jesus for who he was, where the Pharisee Simon did not.
She humbled herself. So Jesus goes on to tell a parable. Because Simon and some were there, must have made a fuss about this. The idea that says, well, this man, if he were a prophet, would have known who and what manner of woman this is who is touching him, for she is a sinner. So if he's really a prophet, he would have known that, and he would have stopped that. Jesus knew what he was thinking. Simon, I have something to say to you. And he said, teach it. And he told this little parable. There was a certain creditor who had 2 debtors. One owed 500 denarii and another 50. And when they had nothing with which to pay, he freely forgave them both. Tell me, therefore, which of them will love him more? And Simon answered and said, I suppose the one who forgave more. Don't you wonder a little bit how he said that? I suppose the one who he forgave more, or I suppose the one who he forgave more. I'm not really sure how he said that. And Jesus said, well, you have rightly judged. And so what is the point? What is Jesus saying about this situation? What is the point Jesus is making now by this parable? What is he teaching?
She recognized how much sin she had to be forgiven of, humbled herself, and so therefore saying, look, you Pharisee, you don't think you have much to be forgiven of. So that's the whole contrast right there.
There it is again. This idea of humility, lowering oneself, submission to the Lord. And that there were those who were so high and mighty religiously, spiritually, who thought they were so good, that again, Jesus is saying, you're really not so good. And this woman who has humbled herself is in a better position than you are. And that's the story that comes out again. Oh, we have a lot more to say, but not a lot of time to do it. Other thoughts or questions you have on this or other points we've talked about tonight?
Do you think that when John was in jail, that he was getting very anxious because maybe he wasn't hearing all that Jesus was doing, and maybe he was just anxious for Jesus to get working?
So Sandy is saying, like, you suppose that maybe John is just kind of getting anxious in jail. He's not seeing or hearing all the events that are going on. He just wants Jesus to get to the program. Do what you came to do, kind of a thing. Which, of course, Jesus is doing that. John only has eyes insofar as those who come and tell him about things that were happening and going on. But through that episode of John asking those questions and Jesus responding to it, basically he is affirming once again, yes, I am the one. I am the one who has come from God. I am that. You are the prophet that foretold of me coming. And yes, I am doing what I need to do. So in that process, he reaffirms all those things again.
But it must have been something to preach to people and tell them about Jesus and get thrown in jail and just get you in there every day.
You can only imagine how hard that is. And of course, John's not done preaching yet. But of course his next preaching episode's not going to last very long. When he's before Herod. But he has just a little while to go yet. Okay, good. So we worked through several of these episodes tonight, these stories that again help us see the compassion of Jesus. We see and identify the humility of those who turn to Jesus. We see the place of faith and how that drives the actions of those who would seek to follow Jesus. And there's lessons, there's applications we make from that too. I hope we learn something from these stories. These are very good and helpful. God willing, on Sunday, it's chapter 8. The outline is out on the hallway. Be sure to pick that up. Thank you so much for being here tonight. Thank you for being so involved.